United Nations is now saying that overfishing is a bigger threat to the world's oceans than plastic pollution. Is it time to stop eating fish if you care about the planet? Welcome to Roundtable. Hello, welcome to the programme. I'm David Foster. Hauling fish out of our oceans at a massive and unsustainable rate is threatening, apparently, entire ecosystems. The UN saying that overfishing is the primary threat to our oceans, more dangerous than plastic or acidifications. So should we stop eating fish to save the seas?
We've heard about the threat to our oceans from plastic. We know about the dangers of acidification through climate change. But according to a recent UN Biodiversity report, overfishing is an even bigger threat to the world's marine life. The UN found over 70% of the world's fisheries are either fully exploited, overexploited, or significantly depleted. And it says that can lead to the destruction of entire ecosystems. However, others like sustainable fisheries argue that the majority of fisheries are sustainable and the greatest threat to our oceans is warm water. According to Global Fishing Watch, fleets from China, South Korea, Japan, Taiwan and Spain accounted for more than 85% of global fishing. If our capacity to kill exceeds the capacity of the seas to replenish, is there such a thing as eating fish responsibly these days?
And I'm very pleased to say that joining us from Edinburgh, we have Aoife Martin, Director of Operations at the government's fishing industry group Seafish. With me in the studio, Richard Caddell, Lecturer in Environmental Law from Cardiff University. Clare Brook joins us, Chief Exec of Blue Marine Foundation, and Griffin Carpenter is here too, a Senior Researcher at New Economics Foundation who specialises in fishing quotas. I have experts all around me, a shoal of experts. Thank you very much for coming in. I want to go first of all to an article that caused quite a bit of a fuss. Stop Eating Fish, effectively. George Monbiot, environmental campaigner in The Guardian. And towards the end of it, he says, there is not a single area of the seas where fish or shellfish can be safely eaten. Until fishing's properly regulated, we should withdraw our consent. What he's basically saying, as I mentioned at the beginning, is that, Griffin, we should stop because we can't do this and we can't continue in the way that we are.
Well, starting with what he's right about. Certainly, if we stop eating fish, there's less of an impact on the oceans. That much is clear. But you need to think one step further. And what George is essentially arguing is that all of our impacts from diet should be on the land. That across the world, that 1/3 that is terrestrial ecosystems should have all of our impact. And of course, terrestrial ecosystems are under threat as well. There's biodiversity loss. There's forestry problems, overharvesting of land. So it seems to me a bit too extreme to say that all of our impact should go on that bit of the world and not the seas.
So are we, Claire, destroying our oceans by overfishing?
It's definitely the key way in which we're destroying the oceans. I mean, there are lots of threats to the ocean, as you said, and acidification and climate change and, of course, pollution, plastic pollution are there. But over-extraction, taking too much out, is reducing the ocean's ability to perform its vital functions of absorbing our CO2 and providing us with oxygen. So effectively, if we overfish excessively, then we will lose the ability to breathe.
Well, do everything to excess, and then there's going to be a downside to it. And Griffin, I'll come back to you in just a moment. You also, Richard. But let's go to Aoife here. You're part of the government's seafood, not regulation, but overseeing body. I don't know what opinion you've got about the high seas, which is areas outside the 200-mile limit, but let me know what you think, because that is supposed to be an area described by George Monbiot as unlawful, unsustainable fishing out there, and we can do nothing about it.
Well, no, thank you, David. I mean, I think there is good understanding and acknowledgement that there is illegal, unregulated and unreported fishing activity on the high seas. But to describe it as being completely lawless is incorrect. there is a huge number of government initiatives to try and manage high seas fishing through regional fisheries management organisations in everything from the Northeast Atlantic down to the Antarctic. We know that through government-wide organisations like the FAO and the OECD, there are initiatives in place to try and better manage and understand high seas fishing. And we also know that the supply chain, so retailers, processors, they expect to be able to demonstrate that their seafood that they are selling has been harvested legally. And so there's a lot of pressure from the supply chain on making sure that seafood, whether it's coming from domestic waters or the high seas, has been sourced legally.
OK, but it's a massive area. It's very difficult to patrol. It is called the high seas for that very reason. Let me talk to you, Richard, about laws that are in place, not ones within our own territorial waters, but those out on the high seas, where most of the fish happen to be. There is something called the United Nations Convention of the Law of the Sea. Does that prevent the stripping of the seas of fish? Is that good enough?
Well, the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, often referred to as the Constitution for the Oceans, which lays down the rights and freedoms for states to undertake particular activities on the sea, has been very clear that the rights to fishing on the high seas is an entrenched element of international law. What it does do is lay down obligations on states to cooperate in order to ensure that stocks are conserved and managed correctly. And as Aoife mentioned, there's like a patchwork quilt of regional fisheries management organisations through which that cooperation is operationalised in practice.
But there's damn all they can do. I mean, it's like asking one person to patrol the sun.
To an extent, and they have struggled in terms of compliance and enforcement mechanisms, and some operate better than others, and it is something of a resource issue as well. So you can take areas such as the Western Central Pacific, where you've got a large number of very small island developing states there that have these enormous expanses of the ocean to patrol and very little resources in order to do so. So there is clearly a need to improve capacity in that respect.
We will talk, if you don't mind waiting for a moment, we'll talk about new measures that might be coming into place, conversations that are happening right now, a little bit later in the programme. But I want to go back to sustainability, Claire. If we carry on as we are at the moment, where will we be?
Well, we are already at a stage where we've depleted 90% of large fish stocks. So, we've clearly gone too far. So better management of the oceans as a whole needs to happen. Now, there are pockets of good management. And I think it's also important at this stage to distinguish between kind of vast industrial fishing operations and small-scale fishing that takes place in coastal regions. I mean, for example, I don't think anyone would want to see the Mediterranean or the coast of the UK completely without any fishing vessels. It would, look foul. And so, and it would be very upsetting for the communities that depend on it. So I think it's very important to distinguish between different fishing efforts, different levels of effort, different degrees of wastefulness, different gear types, some of which is rapacious and damaging.
Well, like the scallops dredgers that go across the bottom of the seabed, destroying everything in their path.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So scallops are a very good example, because a hand-dived scallop is a perfectly sustainable thing to eat. A scallop that has been dredged, where everything has been wrecked in its path, and, by the way, you're also contributing to CO2 emissions by bringing up all the CO2 that's being captured.
But we, the public, we want our scallop and we want to eat it, don't we? We want a scallop at an affordable price. If it was just hand-dived for, it would cost 20 times what it does at the moment.
And it's not 20 times. And
I am guessing there, but it would certainly cost a great deal more than it does if it's harvested on an industrial scale.
Nothing like. And the amount that it costs, that it's going much more to the person who's actually made the effort to dive it. The scallop divers in Lyme Bay, where we have a project, report that there are many, many more scallops down there now that they're not dredging that area. So if you manage an area well, then the fish come back, then there's more fish, which is good for the fishermen who are doing it sustainably and for the people who want to eat the fish.
It is it not, Griffin, the big industrialised fishing trawlers that are wrecking the world?
Certainly by the amount that they take out, that's true. But I think an important point here that Claire brings up is overfishing has happened. We have fished out many stocks, but we're beginning to see recovery of some. So just as much as we focus on the problem, we do have some hints of the solution. So where we are right now in Northern Europe, actually several fish stocks are recovering. And this is because we've made some hard decisions.
Well, tell us what they were.
So the fishing quotas, where it says you can only take out a certain amount. The scientists give some advice and say, based on the size of North Sea cod, you can only fish 30,000 tons. And then that needs to be politically approved.
But am I right, cod stocks and mackerel stocks then started to come back, reached a point, but are now declining again?
It's a very confusing picture, yes. But there are more fish in the North Sea now than there was 10 years ago and 20 years before that. So we had some ambitious policy reforms.
Okay, so quotas, yeah.
Yep.
And?
Well, and the quotas need to be followed as well. And this has been a difficult issue in policy where scientists advise one level and then the government goes and sets a higher one. There needs to be enforcement of these fishing quotas. And then you have areas like the Mediterranean or the Black Sea where actually there aren't fishing quotas at all. It's starting from a much higher level of overfishing, so it's been difficult to get them to that level.
I'm sort of getting the feeling from Griffin here that somebody somewhere has allowed people in certain parts of the world, let's call this the Mediterranean, to get away with it for too long because the political will isn't necessarily there. Is it changing?
Yeah, well, I think so, and very much so. I think we understand the measures that need to be taken to sustainably manage fisheries. There are measures like setting a cap on the amount of fish that can be caught, the type of fishing gear that can be used, where you can fish, and also the measures that you need to take to avoid, remedy, or mitigate any impacts on the marine environment. I think it's also important to recognise, though, that sustainable fisheries are not always at optimal levels. There are other factors at play other than the act of fishing. Things like water temperature change, fish distribution patterns change, and by having sustainably managed fisheries in place, you are able to respond when those issues do arise. And I think, as Griffin has touched on previously, fisheries, when they are managed well, can recover and rebuild surprisingly quickly, particularly when compared to organisms on land.
Okay, not so much what did we do right when it came to preserving cod and mackerel stocks, the example I gave just now, but what has started to go wrong again, do you think? Because the stocks were very, very low. They, as I described, they went up and now they're falling off again. What is not being done now that should be done?
Well, I think when it comes to mackerel, I think what we've seen in the recent advice that came out of ICES in the last couple of weeks is that probably the estimate of the biomass that was given last October was incorrect, and actually the stock is at a higher level than was initially thought. There are complications in how mackerel is managed, though, and that's one of the examples when we touched on some of the challenges on the high seas, because some of the resource is fished outside the EU and the Norway and the Faroes, which have an agreement to manage fishing effort on mackerel. And so there is further work to be done to try and better control that fishing effort.
Which sort of brings us back to the law, Richard. And any one of you at any time, do say whatever's on your mind. Don't wait for me. Brings us back to the law. We talked about UNCLOS, the Convention Law of the Sea. There is an attempt at the moment, described here by the ecologist Douglas Macaulay, as this policy opportunity is much rarer than once in a lifetime. People that the UN are pulling together to change things. Explain what they hope might happen.
Okay, so the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea can be periodically upgraded in many respects through something called an implementation agreement. So there's been one in 1995, which dealt with straddling stocks, fish stocks. There was one in 1994 that dealt with deep seabed mining, and the intention is...
Because there's a lot of important stuff that's been discovered on the bottom of the
Absolutely,
oceans. Yeah.
absolutely. And the third one that they're aiming to get in place by 2020 is something that goes by the acronym BBNJ, which is Biodiversity Beyond National Jurisdiction. So the Law of the Sea Convention laid down a lot of freedoms for states to use the high seas, but also very little opportunity to appropriate it, which was seen as a good thing at the time, so that there couldn't be creeping jurisdiction. But it also meant that it made it very difficult to do things such as set up MPAs, marine protected areas on the high seas. Because you couldn't then impose your jurisdiction on what was essentially a common area of the sea. So one of the objectives of the BBNJ agreement is to develop methodologies and principles by which this will be able to be advanced.
Can I ask you to simplify that? Does it mean that UNCLOS is going to be tougher and more easily enforceable?
Prospectively, they'll be able to introduce new rules and methodologies on how states behave on the high seas. So there's a lot of issues about marine genetic resources, for instance, whether fish can then be turned into medicines, and whether or not that is prospecting or that is fishing. So there's a lot of legal turbulence ahead on that. There are also issues on how states can develop their environmental impact assessments and the obligations.
What are the chances of this going through and effectively they're being tougher?
Yeah.
Everybody being tougher on the fish pirates, if you like.
Absolutely. Well, they will provide a valuable opportunity to establish a set of international laws to govern these waters. At the moment, it's rather unmade. And because we don't have a globalized set of principles, it then makes it very difficult to act on either a regional or an individual basis. So it'll give us a set of reference points by which we'll be able to toughen up some of the protections.
What do you reckon, Aoife? Is this going to work?
I think any initiative that tries to tighten up fishing activity on the high seas has got to be welcomed. I mean, these initiatives take time. I don't think we can rely solely on the kind of government cooperation. I think consumers have a role to play here as well in making sure that they are demanding of their, fishmonger, their supermarket, that they are sourcing sustainably harvested seafood.
Griffin, there's a website called Sustainable Fisheries, I'm sure you all know about it, on which this article I referred to, the George Monbiot one, was fact-checked. And this is something I know you agreed with a lot of the fact-checking points in this. It says, rebuilding a fish population much easier and faster than rebuilding nearly any other kind of animal population. No marine fish has ever gone extinct due to fishing. Do you think all of the arguments we're hearing at the moment is a massive diversion?
No, actually, I'm glad that we're having this conversation, and it's quite hopeful, actually, to have people like George Monbiot putting out one position, and that's how this whole conversation came up. And people want to make sure that they're eating in a way that's in accordance with sustainability. But I think the problem is that...
The suggestion here is that it's exaggerated.
Well, yes. I think we've heard the case from George Monbiot why eating fish proteins has all these problems. But equally, you could write another article. Why eating peppers and cucumbers have all these impacts from greenhouses, why dairy is problematic. You could have all those separate articles, and somebody needs to say, well, let's put this all together. Which proteins are better than others, or which food sources are better than others? And that's what we don't hear. So I would say that there's some balance between our impact on the oceans and on the land, and it's probably not 100%, 0%.
Go on, Claire.
Can I give an example of a fish that has pretty much gone extinct in the wild, which is the Caspian sturgeon, because unfortunately its eggs are, deemed to be some of the most wonderful food on the planet. So there's basically none left in the rivers that feed into the Kura Delta. So it is possible to fish a fish to the point of extinction. And the other point that was being made in the sort of counter article about, fish recover very fast. I mean, you have to distinguish different types of fish. And of course, small, fast-growing fish do recover in an encouraging way. But something like a grouper that takes 14 years to reach maturity so that it can actually start to reproduce, if that's being fished when it's younger and premature, then you are going to literally eliminate an entire species.
So I don't know what the term for it is, but dragnet fishing, I would call it, where you pick up all kinds of different species. That is where one of the biggest problems lies, as far as you're concerned, rather than saying, OK, mackerel here, if we only fish for mackerel, we'll make sure that they're safe. Cod will only fish here, haddock, etc., etc. It's this indiscriminate.
Indiscriminate
Trawling.
fishing is indeed trawling and purse seining, and even dynamite fishing or electric pulse fishing, where you electrocute the entire seabed. So you're eliminating not only what you're trying to get to rise to the surface, but eggs, juveniles, habitats, etc. So as human beings, we've developed some pretty extreme methods of hunting down our prey, unfortunately.
And do you think these new laws, Richard, will prevent something like that, or is it just too big a problem to police properly?
There's been some interesting developments, for instance, for deep-sea trawling. So over the past 15 years or so, the UN has developed a concept called the vulnerable marine ecosystem, and it has been pushing through this agenda for RFMOs to deal with deep water trawling, to set aside areas that are protected from it, to require states to put out their footprints in advance and to have a system of prior restraint. Some of that's been successful, some of that's been a bit of a blunt instrument and not insufficient and somewhat insufficiently nuanced. So there's been a lot of emphasis on things like move-on rules, but by the time you've triggered the move-on rule, you've already caused a lot of damage to the ecosystem in the first place.
OK, you two, Aoife first. We're not going to run out of fish, as far as you're concerned, in any time soon?
No, I don't believe we are. I think we know what we need to do to sustainably manage fish stocks. We see that happening across the globe. Certainly, it's more strongly and tightly managed inside domestic waters, whether that's the EU, New Zealand, the UK. There is work to be done in the high seas, but I think we should recognise, and as Griffin has said, that the EU Commission's independent committee of fisheries scientists does show that the majority of fish populations in EU waters are actually increasing. So that's positive.
Yeah, but there are some rather simple ideas, are there not? Worldwide Fund for Nature. Griffin or Aoife here showed that putting remote monitoring equipment on boats, all boats in Britain, would cost something like £5 million. It's voluntary at the moment, so it would cost virtually nothing in overall terms. And that would work out what they were catching, what they should and shouldn't catch. It would cost £5 million, and yet only 1% of the British fishing boats have taken this up. Why not make that law?
Well, it's one possible tool.
Sounds like a pretty good one if you've got effectively a camera on board and you can see whether they're overfishing young fish, throwing them back in the water, etc., etc.
Yeah, I would say in terms of where I would put my investment if I were a fisheries manager in this, it's actually a lot of these stocks in the north are improving. And I think if we're concerned about populations going extinct, it would actually be elsewhere. So we've spoken a bit about the Mediterranean, but elsewhere around the world, fish stocks are still declining. So we have examples of successful management, but that's not true across the board.
OK, but why not go for this, which would effectively prevent illegal fishing?
Well,
in UK waters.
The premise is that overfishing is happening because of a compliance issue. That they have a quota, let's say, of 100 tons, they're going out and catching 200.
But it could be that they're catching the wrong fish.
It could be that
Juveniles
as well.
that are just thrown back dead.
Yeah.
You'd see
if
that,
you're
wouldn't you,
catching them
if you had this remote monitoring equipment?
Yes, and I suspect actually we will start bringing it on board.
Okay. Do you think the will is there, not just from campaigners such as yourself and responsible people like the four of you at this table, but is the will there from the authorities when we seem to have so many more pressing problems confronting us every day?
And more pressing than absorbing CO2 and releasing.
Well, yes, it's easy to push to one side, is all I'm saying.
Right, yes. I mean, I think overfishing is relatively easy to tackle, as everyone's been saying. So it should be one of the things that we're giving a massive priority to. And I think the good thing about all this focus on plastic pollution, which is, as we've said, one of many problems facing our oceans, is it's really raising the consciousness of the fact that we need to manage this vast and hitherto sort of unnoticed resource so much better. You know, our oceans that cover 71% of the Earth's surface have hitherto been regarded as something that we can just exploit and dump stuff into with impunity. And now people
I know
are
you're saying,
realising
what you're pointing out is why we should do it, but I'm wondering at the moment why we aren't doing it. Is it easy to ignore?
I think the will is there and that the changes are being made. And actually, the British government has made a pledge to protect 30% of the world's oceans. Now, if everyone were to do that, we would be in a state where fish stocks would genuinely start to recover, which would be brilliant. So, you know, well done, Britain, for leading the way.
OK, listen, thank you, everybody. Thank you very much indeed for coming on the programme. Time has flown past. On the one hand, it seems like that we have a major problem which we have to deal with. On the other hand, it seems like you are pretty optimistic that there are ways of doing it. You remember the old expression, there are plenty more fish in the sea. Well, perhaps there aren't. Thank you very much for watching this edition of Roundtable from me, David Foster, and the rest of the team. Goodbye for now.